My goal is by the end of the talk to kind of convince everyone here that ground squirrels and rattlesnakes are both really cool, very interesting organisms. During my master's, I got to spend a lot of time studying them, and in particular, this interesting behavioral interaction that I'm going to be going to in more depth a little bit later in the talk. But just to kind of give you an idea for the talk, I'm kind of splitting it up into 3 different sections. So the first part, I'm going to give you a bit of background about ground squirrels and rattlesnakes, just so you can know their natural history, and then as well as kind of introducing to you this kind of behavioral interaction that they share. Then I'll be going into the methods that we use to study rattlesnakes and ground squirrels, because you can imagine you have to be very careful when you're dealing with potentially a venomous rattlesnake. And lastly, I'll kind of end with some of the summary of the main results from our research, and also show you some interesting videos. All right, so this right here is going to be, this is a California ground squirrel. This is going to be one of the focal organisms for the talk today. California ground squirrels are distributed throughout the western United States, and they're about the same size of the squirrels that you see here kind of running around campus every day. But they live very different. They have very different lifestyles than the kind of tree squirrels that you'll see running around. So as ground squirrels, they spend most of their time on the ground, kind of digging burrows, and they tend to live in kind of these more social colonies. So when you find one ground squirrel, there's lots of ground squirrels in the area. Okay, and typically, and this is about springtime right now. Typically during the early March is when mating begins, and kind of around early to mid-May, this is kind of a typical site that you might see. So we're kind of in a grassland area. But if you can see, this larger squirrel right here is kind of the mom ground squirrel. You can see her with all of her little pups that have just emerged that year. So typically during this time, these pups have just emerged, and now they're kind of foraging out on their own, kind of experiencing the world for the first time, and looking for food. But it's also during this time, you can imagine, for predators, there's kind of a very high concentration of potential prey items in these areas, because the ground squirrels tend to kind of stick around. They have a particular home range. And one of the major predators for ground squirrels is the northern Pacific rattlesnake. So can everyone see the rattlesnake okay in the picture? Sometimes they're really hard to see in the field. But this is a typical position that you would find a northern Pacific rattlesnake in when it's hunting a ground squirrel. You can kind of see it's got this coiled position, and you can almost see, can you see the S right there in its body? And that's kind of the main striking position that these rattlesnakes have prior to encountering a ground squirrel. Now, when these rattlesnakes are hunting ground squirrels, a common position that you'll find them in is kind of right next to a burrow entrance. So you can see the rattlesnake right here, and this is kind of an active squirrel burrow. So they like to kind of maneuver themselves into an area where they can actively capture ground squirrels. And so rattlesnakes, they aren't typically moving around and trying to capture the ground squirrels as they're not chasing them. They kind of sit and wait in a position for hours, sometimes days. I've seen it before. Kind of waiting for ground squirrels to come within striking distance. So the ground squirrel's not lucky, it'll end up like this. So, yeah, this is a baby ground squirrel that is in the process of being swallowed by a rattlesnake. But ground squirrels aren't totally defenseless to rattlesnakes, and in fact they've evolved a number of interesting physiological responses and behaviors to kind of counter predation from rattlesnakes. One of these, just for example, is that ground squirrels actually do have resistance to rattlesnake venom. Now this tends to be more so in the adults, so the adults actually have a larger body volume, and then so they have more proteins in their blood that are able to kind of neutralize an envenomation. So I've seen an adult struck by a rattlesnake before, and it looked like it was hurt, but it ended up being just fine. Whereas the pups, which is what is going down in this rattlesnake's mouth right now, are much more vulnerable to rattlesnake predation. But the rattlesnakes will still treat the pups, or still treat the adults as potential prey. Another thing, ground squirrels, when they're foraging around the colony, if they find a rattlesnake that has recently shed its skin, so for most reptiles, they shed their skin periodically. Ground squirrel finds one of those sheds, it'll pick it right up, it'll start chewing on the shed, and then it starts licking itself. And what that's thought to do is that actually kind of provides them with a chemical cloak of kind of putting the rattlesnake scent on them, and it's supposed to make rattlesnakes much more difficult to detect them. So those are just a couple of the interesting behaviors and physiology of the ground squirrels in response to the rattlesnakes. Now, one of the ones that particularly interested me was this tail waving behavior that ground squirrels do when they encounter a rattlesnake. So just to give you an idea of what this looks like. So just to kind of orient everyone to the screen right here, if you look right here, okay, just all right, just want to make one qualification. This isn't BBC footage, but I think it'll still get the image across. Okay, so if you look closely and it'll come up better, there's a rattlesnake kind of right in this patch of sun, and you can see this ground squirrel right here. And once I play the video, you'll see the ground squirrel begins this tail waving display, and it's gotten really close to the rattlesnake. It's kind of peering over there, constantly bobbing its head and waving its tail side to side. So this kind of gives you a perspective of a ground squirrel when it approaches rattlesnake. So it's kind of this interesting paradoxical behavior. Why a ground squirrel would actually get very close to a rattlesnake, and often within striking distance, and wave its tail side to side. Okay. Another interesting little bit, let's see. Sorry, one sec. Another interesting bit about this interaction is that ground squirrels, when they're waving their tail side to side, it actually looks very different depending on whether they're waving their tail at a gopher snake. Okay, so gopher snake is a non-venomous snake versus a rattlesnake. So when ground squirrels are waving their tail at a rattlesnake, you can actually see their tail right there? It's about the same temperature as their body. Whereas when they're waving their tail at a gopher snake, their tail is just about the same as the background temperature. Now, why do you guys think that might be important for a rattlesnake? Why do you think they would heat up the tail? Does anybody have any thoughts or ideas?
Makes it look bigger.
Might make them look bigger. So why would it make it look bigger to a rattlesnake versus a gopher snake? Does anyone know what's unique about rattlesnakes and pit vipers in general?
Heat sensitive organ?
Exactly. So you can't really tell on this rattlesnake right here, but just where it almost looks like its nose should be, it has these little pits, and they're sensitive to the body heat that's given off by their prey. So this image, this is from a thermal imaging camera, this is essentially what a rattlesnake is looking at when it sees a squirrel. So in this case, ground squirrels are actually heating up their tail when they see a rattlesnake. So one, they can differentiate between a rattlesnake and a gopher snake. But also, it seems like they're trying to tell the rattlesnake something. They're trying to communicate something to the rattlesnake. So this little piece of evidence kind of made me ask, why do ground squirrels wave their tail at rattlesnakes? It seems that they're trying to communicate something to them. Why would they do that? So what I kind of wanted to do right now was I wanted to get everyone's feedback. Let's generate some hypotheses as to why do you think a ground squirrel would wave its tail at a rattlesnake? Any ideas?
Increases its size.
Okay, increases its size, so it's kind of trying to scare the rattlesnake. Okay, increase size. size and scare rattlesnake. Anything else?
I'm wondering if it's sort of marking its territory, trying to say, I'm not actually a ground squirrel, and whatever I am, you don't want to come here.
Oh, okay. Okay, so I'm not a ground squirrel. I'm a ground squirrel. Not a ground squirrel. And stay away from my territory. Anything else? What would you try to tell a rattlesnake? Yes.
It might be saying that it might be trying to say that it might be poisonous.
Oh, so it's trying to trick the rattlesnake. Okay. Okay. So kind of I'm not a ground squirrel. So trick the rattlesnake. Okay. Anything else? Yeah.
Is there a connection between the rattlesnake's tail? Rattlesnake's tail?
Oh, okay. So somehow, the ground squirrel waving its tail might try to make the rattlesnake wave its tail, or it's okay. So some sort of connection to tail. Connection to rattlesnake's tail. This is good. So this is. We're gonna keep going until we get them all down, because this is the process that I was going through during the beginning of my research. Yeah. So yeah, it's definitely making its tail hot. But what is that going to try to communicate to the rattlesnake? What is it maybe trying to do?
The sudden movement will confuse the rattlesnake and
Okay.
make it more apprehensive about attacking.
Okay. So yeah, confuse the rattlesnake. I'm going to just start writing snake. Anything else? Yeah.
Too big to swallow.
Okay, yeah, so increased size, yeah, scare the, or yeah, too big, kind of too big, increased size, yeah, scare rattlesnake, or too big, too small. Okay. Yeah.
Tell them to stay back.
Oh, okay, so yeah, kind of, is it trying to scare it, or? To go away and not eat them. Okay. Yeah.
Trying to look more like a rattlesnake itself.
Okay. Anything else?
Should be having some like it. I have a bigger tail and I have a bigger opponent too.
Okay. Yeah. So kind of.
Like that with bigger shape to your tail.
Oh.
Like
Okay.
I'm a bigger opponent to you. So you
I have
both
a bigger tail than.
Yeah,
Than your tail. Okay. So kind of, but still kind of along the same lines of intimidation.
Yeah.
Right. Yeah.
Like bite my tail, not mine.
Oh, okay. So kind of going along with the confusion, kind of indirect, like if I am this close to you, but I'm going to wave my tail here, strike at that point. So yeah, confuse a rattlesnake, and strike at tail. Any other last hypothesis?
Moving target, hard to hit.
Okay, so so maybe kind of like along the same lines, could we put that with confuse a rattlesnake, essentially making it more difficult to strike at them. Any others? Yeah.
Letting the rattlesnake know it doesn't taste very good, like the squirrel.
So letting it know it doesn't, even though they do taste.
Do they?
I think so. Well, they eat them quite a bit.
Do they?
So yeah, they're one of. So yeah, I should say ground squirrels are one of the like major prey items.
Or the rattlesnake.
of rattlesnakes. Even though adults not so much, but rattlesnakes still treat adults as ground squirrels.
It's a very altruistic ground squirrel that really wants to warn his fellow ground squirrels.
Okay, so yeah, communicating to other ground squirrels.
Willing to give up his life for that.
Okay. Altruistic. Any other ones? What about maybe just telling the rattlesnake that it sees it? Like, so, hey, I see you. Or maybe that it's kind of, not necessarily that it sees it, but it's kind of worried that there is a rattlesnake. So a lot of times, I should mention, when ground squirrels are waving their tail, most of the time they do it when they see a rattlesnake, but they'll also do it when they're in areas where they suspect that there might be a snake. Okay, so I think we've got a good set of hypotheses to kind of work with right now. And we'll visit them at the end of the talk to kind of see which ones might hold up. Okay. So this was the main question that was kind of the focus of my master's research. Now I'm going to tell you a little bit about the methods that we kind of use to study these organisms right here. So one of the things we had to do is we had to go to a site where we could actually go to a site where there are a lot of rattlesnakes and a lot of ground squirrels, because we've got to be able to document a lot of interactions between them. So this is a picture of one of my field sites. So not only does it have a lot of rattlesnakes and ground squirrels, but it's also a beautiful area. It's typically kind of this grassland community with scattered oak woodland throughout the site. And this site was actually kind of in northern California area. Now, in addition to going to a nice study site, we also spent a lot of time capturing ground squirrels. So this is a picture of me when I had a bigger red beard with one of my field assistants. And this is a ground squirrel that we just captured, and we're painting a little number on its side. So I don't know if you saw in one of the videos, but the ground squirrel actually had a number on its side. And the reason why we did this is so we could know, okay, which ground squirrel is interacting with the rattlesnake, so we could kind of link their identities together, okay? And so we would know also, is this ground squirrel, is it a female, is it a male, or is it a pup or an adult? Another thing that we had to do is we had to capture a lot of rattlesnakes, because one of the things that we're interested, kind of the best way to document a lot of these interactions is to actually follow the rattlesnakes. So we spent a lot of our time searching the area, and as well as setting up these little traps. So this is you kind of see this board right here, and there's a funnel, and the rattlesnake actually, it kind of hit the board and just started going to the side, and then ends up going into the trap there. And then so you can see I have this, typically how we handle rattlesnakes. So these are called tongs, and essentially it prevents the rattlesnake from being able to strike me and allows me to safely pick up the rattlesnake. And then I end up putting it in a pillowcase, essentially a pillowcase, and we take it back to the field station. Now, once we get it back to the field station, we have to have a way where we can safely handle these rattlesnakes, so we can take measurements on them. And then also remember, we want to be able to track them on a regular basis. So we need to be able to attach a radio transmitter to them. So one of the ways that we safely handle these rattlesnakes is by using this plastic tube. We actually put the tube over the rattlesnake, so then we can safely handle them. So I've got this little video that kind of shows you how this is safely done. So this is a different species of rattlesnakes, but this is a red diamond rattlesnake. You can kind of see me, I'm kind of moving around the rattlesnake very carefully, and slide the tube over the rattlesnake's head and give it a little encouragement to go up, and there you go. You have a rattlesnake rattlesnakes in the tube, and now we can safely take measurements on the rattlesnake, of course, usually with another person to kind of help us out. But also during this stage, we've got them in a nice position so we can actually start conducting a surgery. So one of the things we have to do before we conduct the surgery is we have to essentially kind of knock them out. So give them an anesthetic so they'll go to sleep. So we're able to put a piece of cloth at the end with this substance called isoflurane, which they inhale and then they go to sleep. The interesting thing about rattlesnakes though, when they go to sleep, their eyes, they don't have eyelids, so their eyes are still open. So you have to just kind of monitor their body to make sure they're, okay, it's not moving, it's safe. Okay, so that's one of the, so that's what we would do to kind of start the surgery. And this is just a picture of me at our field station on a picnic bench. But we've got kind of all of our tools set up for a very sterile procedure. And you can see I've got the rattlesnake laid out, so you can kind of see the tube at the end. And then what we do during this time is we've also got a limited window of time in which we have to work. But we kind of make a little incision about a third of the way up the rattlesnake's body. And then into the body is where we implant this radio transmitter. So this radio transmitter is about this long, and you can kind of see inserting the transmitter into the rattlesnake's body. And then what we end up doing with the antenna, so the transmitter goes inside the body cavity of the rattlesnake, and then the antenna just runs along the skin up the inside of their body. So you might be kind of wondering, okay, is that going to hurt the rattlesnake? Are you going to be able to observe their behavior normally? It does take them, before they actually start hunting, maybe like a week or two before they'll kind of return to their normal behavior. But all of our monitored snakes, they gained weight, they were capturing ground squirrels, so it didn't really seem to have much of an effect on their future behavior. So once the snakes were implanted with the radio transmitters, we had to start tracking them so we could relocate them on a daily basis. So this is an example of kind of a radio antenna. So this is a receiver right here, and then we've got the antenna, and essentially you turn it to the snake's radio station, okay, its channel, and then you start pointing the antenna in different directions, and depending on where the beep is coming from, that's where the rattlesnake is. So if the beep, if I point it over here and there's the beeping is louder over here, start following. Okay, and then typically though, you've got to be very careful, especially when you start getting very close to the rattlesnake. And that's when you got to not only start using the radio telemetry, but also your eyes as well, because rattlesnakes are really good at hiding in places where you can't see them. But this is essentially the method that we use to monitor the rattlesnakes. Then what we did after that is, remember, we were interested in documenting these interactions. So we essentially set up these portable video surveillance cameras. So any of the video surveillance cameras that you see around commercial buildings, we just had that same setup, but we modified it into a portable system so we could pick up the camera and move it onto the rattlesnakes as they move. So this gives you, this is essentially the view of the camera on the rattlesnake. Now remember, just kind of wanted to remind you, one of the things about rattlesnakes is that, remember, they like to sit in an area and they've got to wait for the squirrels to come within striking distance, right? So we're able to use this method and monitor the rattlesnakes for hours at a time. And as the rattlesnakes move to a new site, we retrack them down and reposition the cameras. So this enabled us to get video footage of ground squirrels that are interacting with rattlesnakes, so we could get estimates of how close ground squirrels came to rattlesnakes, as well as how much what they were tail flagging, and as well as link that to the rattlesnake's striking behavior or its future movements. Okay. Okay. So after all, So after all of those videos, and let me tell you, I had thousands of hours of videos to go through. Luckily, I could fast forward through it pretty quickly. But we scanned through all of these videos to kind of try to get a sense of whether or not these tail waving displays, if they influence the rattlesnake's behavior or not. So the first question we kind of asked, and this doesn't really get at the mechanisms that we were kind of talking about there, but like, does tail waving, does it cause the rattlesnakes to strike at the squirrels, or does it deter the rattlesnakes from striking? Okay, so I promise I only have a couple of data slides, but let me just, it's cut off at the bottom. Okay, what we have here on the x-axis, this is distance, okay, in centimeters, okay? So 0 to 35 centimeters. About 35 centimeters was the strike distance of the rattlesnakes in our study, so any of the squirrels in this range were vulnerable to being struck by a rattlesnake. Right here, these are all of the instances where a rattlesnake did not strike at a squirrel, even though it was within striking distance. And those are all the occasions where a rattlesnake did strike a squirrel when it was within striking distance. The X, which is just cut off right up here, these are instances where the ground squirrel was tail flagging at the rattlesnake when it was in this close range. And the red circles are the instances where the ground squirrel, it didn't notice the rattlesnake, so it didn't tail flag. Okay? So the main thing, kind of take-home message from this slide is that at about outside 10 centimeters, so this is still within striking range, 10 to 30 centimeters, if the ground squirrel's tail flagging, the rattlesnake is not striking at the ground squirrel, okay? However, even if the ground squirrel's tail flag, if they come within 10 centimeters, you can see some of the black X's up there, the rattlesnakes will strike at the squirrels. Okay, so what this is suggesting is that the tail flagging display does deter the rattlesnakes from striking unless the ground squirrels get too close. Okay, so it seems to be deterring the rattlesnakes from striking. Now we kind of wanted to try to get at, okay, but why isn't the rattlesnake striking? Okay, because that's an important piece of information. Oh, actually, before I do that, I did want to kind of show you a couple of video examples. Let's see. A couple of video examples of these different interactions. So if I kind of orient you to the screen right here, this is a rattlesnake kind of in a typical position. It's got the S position. It's right at the entrance to a ground squirrel burrow. And now you'll see the ground squirrel come within. So this ground squirrel comes within striking distance, but it's outside of that 10, 11 centimeter range. Okay, so yeah, it's moving its tail. It's doing the tail waving display, but the rattlesnake is not striking, even though it's well within the striking distance of the rattlesnake. Okay. So that's one of the instances where the rattlesnake didn't strike at a tail flagging squirrel when it was far away. And here is another video. So this is when the ground squirrel actually becomes too close to the rattlesnake. So just to show you another video, remember these are on low quality surveillance cameras. But there's a rattlesnake, and you see this little white patch right here? That's the rattlesnake essentially looking at you right there. Okay, and then from right here, you're going to see a ground squirrel come within the frame, and you'll notice its behavior. So the ground squirrel comes, it's really close to the snake, waves its tail, strikes. So the rattlesnakes, that's typically what they do. They strike, envenomate, and then they release right away. But in that instance, the ground squirrel was successfully struck by the rattlesnake. But so it still is kind of this interesting question: why would a ground squirrel, when it's so close, still wave its tail at the rattlesnake? The next piece of data that we wanted to look at was kind because we notice a lot of times when squirrels get very close to rattlesnakes, a lot of times they're actually still able to dodge a snake strike. Okay, so squirrels have an amazing ability, even when they don't see a rattlesnake strike, or even when they don't see the rattlesnake, they're still able to dodge out of the way before the snake is actually able to successfully strike them. So one of the things we looked at for the squirrels that did tail flag at the rattlesnake, and where the rattlesnake still struck, we kind of looked at our squirrels, this tail flagging may be associated with this dodging behavior. So is tail flagging essentially saying, you know what, I'm vigilant, there might be a snake in this area, so I'm ready to kind of dodge out of the way, because dodging is going to reduce the snake's ability to successfully strike the squirrel. And what you see is for squirrels that do tail flag at the snake, 100% of the time they dodge from the snake. They aren't always successful, but they're ready to dodge out of the way whenever they wave their tail. Whereas squirrels that don't tail flag, occasionally they are able to dodge out of the way about 40% of the time, but it's still not nearly as strong of an association. Okay, so what this is suggesting to me is that ground squirrels, with their tail waving, they're essentially advertising their vigilance to the snake, because a lot of times, like going back to that video of that little pup that got very close to that rattlesnake, it's not clear as to whether or not the ground squirrel actually even saw the rattlesnake, or if it was just worried that there was a snake in the area, so it might be advertising their vigilance toward the snake. Okay, so in addition to this potentially advertising their vigilance, it seems that that's one of the major functions of this tail waving behavior. We kind of brought up this potentially altruistic function, or maybe this tail flagging is able to communicate other information to ground squirrels in the area, because a lot of times there's, in these areas, there's often not just one squirrel, but nearby there's occasionally other squirrels. So potentially ground squirrels might be communicating to other squirrels in the area, and why would that be bad for the snake? Any ideas? Exactly. So essentially the other squirrels in the area now know, okay, there's a rattlesnake right here, so from the rattlesnake's perspective, I'm not going to be getting any dinner today. Okay? So it might benefit the rattlesnake if after a tail waving display, if that tail waving communicates to other squirrels in the area, then the rattlesnake should leave as well, because it's no longer going to be successful if it stays around in that area. Now, what we actually found was when ground squirrels, when adult ground squirrels wave their tail, rattlesnakes are about 1.5 times more likely to leave the area compared to if they had not received a display. So it does seem to have a small effect on rattlesnakes leaving the particular area. However, if a pup, one of these pups, is to tail flag at a rattlesnake, the rattlesnakes stay put. Okay, so they don't actually leave the area. And the interesting thing is that rattlesnakes actually have a higher success of striking a squirrel in an area after it's been tail flagged at by a pup. So that sounds a little interesting, but from previous research has shown that when pups tail flagging, other squirrels in the area don't really listen. Okay, so they aren't necessarily taking into the account the information that the pup is conveying, and that could be because the pup is exploring this new environment and might spend a lot of time just waving his tail anyway, so you don't want to listen to this tail flagging display. But adults listen, adults and pups listen to adult squirrels tail flagging. Okay, and just to kind of give you an idea of, because it seems a little paradoxical why rattlesnakes would still be successful, but I've got this little video here. So tough. There's a rattlesnake positioned right here. The tip of his nose right here, and we have a ground squirrel right here, and this is a ground squirrel pup that's just got done displaying. So it was displaying at this rattlesnake, waving its tail side to side for the previous 3 minutes or so. And what you'll see is eventually this ground squirrel is going to leave. And you can see this other squirrel up in the area over there. It comes over into the general area. Now it's not clear as to whether or not that ground squirrel was communicating where that information was passed on to the squirrel, but you can see the squirrel comes over, is not aware that a rattlesnake's right there, and it was just struck by a rattlesnake. So it doesn't seem like that information that squirrel, when it was tail waving, it wasn't being communicated to the other squirrel. At least it didn't take into account that information. Okay, so some of the major findings from my research is that it seems that tail waving does deter from rattlesnakes from striking unless squirrels get too close. Okay, and the primary reason why tail waving deters rattlesnakes from striking is because a tail flagging squirrel essentially means a squirrel that's going to dodge, and squirrels have a much easier time dodging out of the way of a snake if they're further away. Which makes sense, right? So that's why squirrels or rattlesnakes are still willing to take a chance at striking at squirrels that are within that short 10-centimeter range, because they still have a good chance of striking at it, even though it's dodging. Like, so for example, that one baby squirrel that got very close to the rattlesnake, if you slow that video down and go frame by frame, the squirrel actually does start to dodge out of the way, just not in time. Other couple of things are that rattlesnakes are more likely to leave a hunting area after being approached and displayed at by an adult squirrel. And that is likely because adult tail waving kind of raises the awareness about snakes' presence to other squirrels in the area, but pup tail flagging does not do that. Okay, so that's kind of some of the major findings from my research. Of course, I did not do any of this all by myself. I had a lot of great field assistants, of which these are only a few, some funding sources that help fund this research, and this is my master's advisor, Dr. Merlin Clark, who's still continuing work on rattlesnake ground squirrel interactions. It's just kind of the start. All right, thanks a lot for having me.